Chapter 1. The Voice of Discontent. The desert blazed like a crucible, turning the sand into scattered embers. The sun, a merciless brazen disk, bore down upon the camp of Israel, and the air around them trembled, warping and hallucinating, as if anticipating a tremendous storm that refused to break. 40 years of exile had become a burden, unbearable to the body, and, most terrifyingly, to the soul. The people, who had recently sung the song of liberation on the shore of the Red Sea, a hymn of freedom that had shattered chains centuries old, were now muttering, like a stream of dark, muddy water flowing into an abyss of disappointment. In their hearts, hardened in the fire of Egyptian furnaces, weariness grew, a deep, viscous weariness, like quicksand that consumes a person with every step. And along with it, like a poisonous weed, resentment rose. They recalled Egypt, not the land of the whip and tears, but the land of certainty. There, in the shadow of the colossal pyramids, there was always a guaranteed bowl of cooked fish, always onions that brought tears to their eyes, but filled their stomachs, and garlic that gave strength for exhausting labor. Slavery now seemed to them a memory not as bitter as the thirst for freedom that could not satisfy them with bread and water. Their memory, always selective and treacherous, erased the pain of bondage and left only the illusion of plenty. They failed to see that the fish was bait, and the onion was a reward for every groan wrenched from the heart. Moses, the leader whose face glowed from conversations with heaven, stood amid this camp, feeling like a rock slowly but inevitably eroded by the waves of human dissatisfaction. He listened to this noise like the whisper of a tempting demon, seeking to undermine his patience. His soul was heavy, for he carried not only this multi-million, capricious people, but also the doubt nested in their hearts, like a den of venomous snakes. He saw their faith, which should have been armor, turn into a thin fabric torn by the first gust of wind. Why did you lead us out of the land of plenty, only to die here? The questions rang out like daggers thrown at his heart. They were not seeking answers. They were demanding a miracle, demanding proof. They wanted God to be their servant, dispensing food and drink at their first gesture. Moses felt loneliness, his constant companion, clutching him even tighter. He stood between two fires, the anger of the Almighty, who saw all their ingratitude, and the blind despair of people who could not see past their stomachs. His hands trembled as he raised them to the sky, and it was not the tremor of fear, but the tremor of responsibility for the destinies he was commanded to lead. He knew freedom is not just a gift, but the heaviest of trials. And the people's murmuring was nothing but the bitter admission that a slave's soul, even when snatched from captivity, longs to return to the familiar, though cruel, certainty. This voice of discontent was the cry of a slave afraid of responsibility for his own life. Chapter 2. Manna from Heaven. That night, when the sky was silent with an incomprehensible, cosmic stillness, Moses fell prostrate. The sand, which was scorching hot during the day, now gave off its coldness, and this was the cold of despair that penetrated the prophet. His prayer was not a request, but a groan. He poured out before the Creator all the heaviness of his heart, all the meanness of human ingratitude he had just endured. He pleaded not for relief for himself, but for mercy for the people he carried, like a father carries a disobedient child. And God answered. His answer came not in thunder, nor in flame, but in a thin, quiet whisper that pierced the night darkness. In the morning, when the first trembling rays of light touched the eastern horizon, and the dense, cold dew fell upon the camp, the people saw the wonder. The earth was covered with an inexplicable phenomenon. Tiny white grains, like snow or frost, shining like crystals newly born of the dawn light. It was something utterly alien to the desert, something that looked like solidified music. "Manna!" someone exclaimed, their voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "What is this?" others asked, frightened by the unknown nature of the phenomenon. Their distrust was so great that they could not immediately accept the gift. They were accustomed to labor, to sweat, to bread being wrestled from the earth by effort. Now the bread itself descended from heaven. Moses, whose face was calm and majestic, replied, his voice ringing over the camp like a solemn bell. "This is the lechem, bread, which the Lord has given you. Eat, and let it remind you that man lives not by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." The people rushed to gather, and everyone who tasted it felt a flavor on their tongue, unlike any earthly fruit. It was delicate, like honey, and satisfying, like the finest bread. Thus, the people who had complained and cursed Moses yesterday, today ate heavenly bread and marveled at the boundless mercy that covered their ingratitude. It was a daily, invisible covenant between heaven and earth. Every morning, conditioned by the dawn and faith, the wonder returned. But inevitably, over time, even the manna became routine. Its miraculous nature, its heavenly origin, faded in the eyes of the people, turning into a monotonous daily ration. Complaints, like old driven-off dogs, return to the camp, for the human heart, if it is not open to grace, is not satisfied by any miracle. They began to resent the uniformity. They craved variety and meat. They wanted to reclaim their right to choose, even if that choice led back to bondage. They forgot that the manna was a pure gift that freed them from worry about tomorrow, giving them time for spiritual growth. They exchanged freedom from care for the slavery of desire. And this is the tragedy. The greatest, most epic miracle in human history, bread falling from the sky, turned into a cause for boredom and renewed discontent. Moses looked at them and understood. In the desert, one can feed the body, but faith is the only hunger that a person must satisfy themselves. Chapter 3. The waters of Meribah. Their path wound through scorched earth, over sharp, unforgiving stones that tore at souls and hearts. And again, for the umpteenth time, disaster struck. There was no water. This was not just an everyday inconvenience. It was the epicenter of despair. Thirst is the beast that tears apart the remnants of human dignity. The people, who were full of heavenly bread yesterday, today, parched, raised a storm of anger that ominously hung over Moses. They stood before him like a turbulent black sea before a tempest, their faces contorted, their voices sounding like the cracking of dry wood. "Why did you bring us out here to die of thirst? Us, our children, and our livestock," they shouted. And in that cry was not only physical agony, but also betrayal, accusation, and defiance of the divine promise itself. They again forgot the miracles, how the sea had parted. For them, only the current, hellish moment existed. Moses, feeling the sweat of heat and anxiety run down his temples, lifted the staff, which had become the symbol of the authority given by God, and cried out to the Lord in frenzy, "What am I to do with this people?" In a little while, they will stone me." This was the cry not only of a leader, but of a man who had reached the limit of his endurance. And the Lord, who was always greater than human failings, replied, "Speak to the rock that is before you, and it shall yield water." God offered a miracle based on the word, on the quiet, humble acknowledgement of the Creator's power. But anger, righteous and yet hellish, seized the prophet's heart. Moses recalled their ingratitude, their ceaseless murmuring, their betrayal that turned his life into continuous suffering. He saw before him not his brothers, but spiteful, ungrateful faces ready to revolt at any moment. His patience was exhausted. Instead of humbly speaking to the stone, which was meant to be a symbol of Christ, Moses, in the pride of his righteousness, decided to show them his power, crying out, "Must we bring forth water for you from this rock?" He struck the staff twice, not to obey, but to assert his own authority, which had trembled under the people's pressure. The water flowed, a powerful, saving torrent that filled the rocks and quenched the thirst of thousands. The people rushed to the source, forgetting their recent fury. But along with the water, a shadow of doubt and a bitter, burning shadow of punishment flowed into Moses' heart. Moses realized that faith, even great faith, even the faith that spoke with heaven, could tremble and stumble due to human pain. His fault was not disobedience, but the loss of humility. He appropriated the miracle, attributing it to himself rather than to the Word of God. The name of that place was Meribah, contention, and it became a monument not only to the people's unbelief, but also to the tragedy of the great prophet, who, at the moment of his greatest trial, forgot the silence that should have consecrated his deed. For this, Moses was denied entry into the promised land. The price of 1 second of pride was higher than 40 years of faithfulness. Chapter 4. The Flame of Rebellion. But the greatest, most terrible upheaval came not from physical thirst or hunger, but from metaphysical pride, from the unrestrained desire for power and recognition. It was an internal disease that erupted in a flame intended to consume the spiritual order of the camp. The heart of Korah, a Levite, a relative of Moses and Aaron, was kindled against the leader. He was a wealthy, influential man, but envy gnawed at his soul. Why did Moses and Aaron stand above all others? Why did they possess all the glory, all the power, all the honor? Korah could not accept that the service he considered his right was only a step, not the summit. He gathered men, nobles, and elders, 250 of them, the most respected, the most eloquent, and those harboring grievances. This was the elite, confident in its strength and intellect. They rose against Moses and Aaron, and their voice rang over the camp like a deadly verdict. "You have gone too far. Is Moses alone holy? Does God not speak through all of us? Why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" There was a false truth in their words. They demanded equality, but not equality in duties, but equality in power. They sought not to uplift the people, but to overthrow the leader to take his place. Moses, hearing this, did not argue or justify himself. He fell prostrate, not before the people, not before their malice, but before God. His posture was not one of weakness, but an act of absolute surrender to the will of the Almighty. His soul cried out, "I did not choose this authority. I did not want this burden. May you, O Lord, show who your chosen one is." This was the highest act of yielding judgment. Moses threw them a challenge that was to become their sentence. Let each of you take his censer, fill it with fire and incense, and we shall see whom the Lord chooses." The ritual of burning incense was Aaron's sacred privilege. When the 250 men appeared with censers before the tabernacle, they unknowingly signed their own death warrant. Then the glory of the Lord appeared in all its majesty, and Moses, feeling the earth tremble, cried out to the people to move away from the tents of the rebels. "If these men die a common death," Moses said, "then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new—" His words were interrupted. The earth, that silent witness to all human passions, which had listened to the words of pride, suddenly split open. It was not just an earthquake. It was the tearing of the very fabric of reality. A gaping chasm opened beneath the feet of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. It swallowed them, their families, and all their possessions, and the dust of the desert, like a predatory beast, immediately consumed them forever. The people saw this and trembled with terror, like leaves in the wind, for they understood. Rebellion against the leader chosen by heaven is not just a political act. It is a rebellion against the Almighty, challenging the very foundations of existence. The fire that came from the Lord also consumed the 250 men who had come with their censers. It was a lesson written in fire and fissured earth. God does not tolerate the pride that tries to masquerade as piety. Leadership is a burden imposed by heaven, not a right that can be seized by force and envy. Chapter 5. Memory and Mercy. Years passed, and every journey through the desert left indelible traces. They were not only in the perpetually vanishing sand, but in the hearts of those who grew up. These traces were lessons about the wonder that turns into habit, about the mercy that meets ingratitude, about the wrath that erupts from the depths of the earth. Moses looked at the people who were born and died amid miracles and transgressions, and understood. Faith is born not in the miracle, but in repentance, in the quiet, internal readiness to acknowledge one's insignificance before the majesty. He observed how the generation of slaves who complained against him gradually faded, giving way to a generation born in freedom. This new generation, which did not remember Egypt but remembered the abyss of Korah, proved to be more hardened and more obedient. Their memory was pierced with pain, but this pain was their armor. They saw the manna fall every morning, but now they saw in it not just food, but a promise. And as the time of trials drew to a close, when the manna, that bread that fell from heaven, was about to fall for the last time, it was a sign. It was a premonition of the end. The springs in the desert were drying up, for the time had come to drink the water of the rivers of the promised land. And this land, this dream of 40 years, was visible on the horizon, high and unattainable, like a reward that he, Moses, was forbidden to touch. Moses prayed on Mount Nebo. He prayed not for glory, not for the cancellation of his punishment, but for mercy for the people. He asked the Lord not to abandon his people, even when they again, inevitably, forget their gratitude. He knew that human disobedience is great and eternal, resurrecting in every new heart. But he knew that God's mercy is boundless and bottomless. It is higher than all human failings. In his final words, he commanded them, "Do not forget the lessons of the desert, for it was their school of faith." He asked them to remember that the greatest miracle is neither the water flowing from the rock nor the bread from heaven, but the ability of their heart to remain open and grateful. This was the farewell sermon of the prophet, in which he confessed, "I too stumbled, but God, even in punishing, remained faithful." And this was the greatest inspiration, not the holiness of the leader, but the unwavering faithfulness of the Creator. Even as Moses gazed upon the promised land he could not touch, his final act was a prayer that this mercy might accompany his people forever. For human disobedience is great, but the mercy of God is boundless.